very much, Richard, for that warm welcome, and it's a great pleasure to be here tonight. And thank you so much for coming out on what has become a rather cool evening. I very much appreciate it. Well, tonight I'm going to talk about a little-known tale relating to Nauru. And I think many Australians today don't know much about Nauru, other than the fact that it is a Pacific Island country, some 4,000 kilometres from our northeast coast, which has agreed to take in Australia's asylum seekers who arrive by boat in exchange for millions of dollars of aid money and assistance. This hot, rocky island was for many years a lucrative source of high-grade phosphate, which the governments of Australia, New Zealand and the United Kingdom mined to exhaustion. The island's small, it's only 21 square kilometres, but the mining by these governments was so extensive that scientists said the country would be rendered uninhabitable by the mid-1990s. With the exorbitant cost of rehabilitating the land, plans were made during the 1960s to relocate the entire population of Nauru to Curtis Island off the coast of Queensland. But in the end, the Nauruans refused to go. They said they didn't want to be assimilated into white Australia and lose their distinctive identity as a people. Today, the mined-out phosphate areas cover almost 90% of Nauru, with limestone pinnacles exposed to a depth of up to 6 metres. The rehabilitation that has occurred has been extremely expensive and very slow. And the Environmental Vulnerability Index classifies Nauru as extremely vulnerable, which is the highest level of vulnerability. One reason why Nauru does agree to host an offshore detention centre for Australia today is precisely because mining has rendered the island incapable of supporting any local agriculture or industry. Its very high unemployment rate, scarce labour opportunities, and the virtual absence of any private sector make any source of local income for the country attractive. These factors, of course, also underscore exactly why the permanent resettlement of refugees on Nauru is wholly unsustainable. Nauru and Australia have a long and fraught relationship. Australia was the administrating power and the main beneficiary of phosphate mining between 1920 and 1968, during which time some 34 million tonnes of phosphate was removed, valued at around 300 million Australian dollars. Nauru had actually been a German protectorate from 1886, but it was captured by Australian forces in November 1914. Prime Minister Billy Hughes was anxious to annex Nauru because of its lucrative phosphate resources that had been mined by the Pacific Phosphate Company since 1907. The phosphate was of great value to Australia's agricultural export industry, which needed fertilisers to improve the quality of its soil. As Australia's Treasurer, W.A. Watt, explained, Nauru's phosphate deposits rendered it of considerable value, not only as a purely commercial proposition, but because the future productivity of our continent absolutely depended on having fertiliser. Australia pressed its case at the Paris Peace Conference at the end of the war for mandate status over Nauru, but this was formally granted to the British Empire in 1920. The UK, Australia and New Zealand concluded a tripartite agreement, which was known as the Nauru Island Agreement of 1919, pursuant to which Australia was appointed as the administrator of Nauru. Having bought out the Pacific Phosphate Company, the agreement between the three governments also established a board of commissioners, which was known as the British Phosphate Commissioners, represented by each of the partner governments, in whom all title to the phosphate deposits became vested. They then acquired all the assets and undertakings of the mining company and assumed exclusive title over the phosphate deposits. In the opinion of Judge Weeramantry of the International Court of Justice, this was wholly consistent with the very notion of a mandate, namely being a sacred trust for the benefit of the residents of the mandated territory, not for the profit of what was essentially a company pursuing commercial and other interests of the administering powers. The trusteeship regime established on Nauru was focused on exploiting phosphate rather than promoting the material and moral well-being and social progress of the Nauruans. And indeed, in 1963, the New Zealand Prime Minister privately confirmed that the main object of the whole exercise was to secure the supply of cheap phosphate to Australia and New Zealand. During the Second World War, Nauru was occupied by the Japanese, and during this time, most of the phosphate workings were destroyed. In 1947, Nauru became a trust territory of Australia, New Zealand and the UK, with Australia once again designated as the administrating authority. The UN Trusteeship Council consistently raised concerns about Australia's neo-colonialist attitude to Nauru and recommended a larger degree of self-governance by the Nauruans themselves. In 1966, Nauru became self-governing, and in 1968 it attained independence. So this question of resettling the whole population of Nauru, that was first raised in 1949, when the Australian government thought the phosphate workings would be exhausted, the phosphate deposits would be exhausted within 70 years, and all but the coastal strip of Nauru would be rendered worthless. But by the mid-50s, the CSIRO had revised the estimate down to 40 years and said that rehabilitation of the land would be so expensive as to be wholly impractical. Before 1940, Australia had thought, as I mentioned, that the coastal rim of Nauru would provide sufficient land for the population to reside on indefinitely. But with the increasing need for phosphate by Australian farmers in the post-war period and the growth of Nauru's population, it became clear that this land was inadequate. So resettlement became an attractive option for Australia, not least because it would open up the prospect of mining the entire island. The idea that you could pick up and relocate a community to another country was not exactly regarded as far-fetched or fanciful during this period. In fact, it was an already utilised policy tool in the Pacific, and it tapped into a popular sentiment that was prominent during the early to mid-20th century, that you could redistribute the world's population around the globe as a way of reducing resource scarcity and in turn reducing the need for conflict. Visiting missions to Nauru by the UN in 1950, 1953 and 1956 pinpointed resettlement as the only viable long-term solution. Possible relocation sites in and around Fiji, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands and even the Northern Territory of Australia were explored, but were ultimately found to be inappropriate. Nevertheless, the UN visiting missions suggested that a gradual resettlement plan be concluded as soon as possible, rather than waiting until the phosphate deposits were exhausted. They also said that attention should be given to equipping the younger Nauruans with vocational skills that would help them to find employment in other parts of the Pacific. Although Australia supported resettlement from Nauru, it rejected the UN mission's view that phosphate mining was the reason why it was necessary. Australia said that while mining had destroyed much of the land, that wasn't the chief problem. Rather, it countered, contact with European enterprise and the adoption of European ways and standards were the real reasons. The UN Trusteeship Council thought this was totally illogical, and it said while we recognise that Nauru can't continue to support its population at their current standard of living, this was inextricably connected to the environmental destruction caused by phosphate mining, as well as to population growth. By and large, the Nauruan population wanted to stay put. They said this was the only way that they could preserve their identity as a people. But recognising the dismal projections for Nauru's ongoing habitability, the head chief, Hammer de Robert, mobilised support for resettlement, telling the UN Visiting Mission in 1956 that the Nauruans were now more in favour of community resettlement in Australia, but they were opposed to gradual or piecemeal resettlement, by which they meant gradual individual migration. This was because, at this time, Australia was proposing that they, and I quote, steadily educate the Nauruans to a stage where they could fit into the economic and social life of an Australian territory like Papua New Guinea, or perhaps even Australia, rather than trying to find an island to which they could be resettled as a group. Instead, the Nauruans sought a commitment from the partner governments, Australia, New Zealand and the UK, to meet the costs of finding them a new homeland. This would include the cost of setting up villages, administrative centres, other public institutions and communication systems. In 1955, attempts were made to secure Woodlark Island, which lay between Papua New Guinea and the British Solomon Islands Protectorate. But these plans were abandoned when it became clear that the island simply didn't meet the needs of the Nauruans. Namely, there weren't enough employment opportunities, there wasn't a host community that would willingly accept them, and there was also an issue about the willingness on the part of the Nauruans to mix with the host population. Again, the UN emphasised that the partner governments had a moral obligation to provide the most generous assistance they could towards the costs of whatever settlement scheme happened to be approved, since it was those governments that had benefited from low price, high quality phosphate. I think if you pause for a moment and think how this might play out in the context of climate change and the, which countries have benefited most from greenhouse gas emissions and so on, we can draw some very interesting parallels. Prime Minister Robert Menzies acknowledged that three governments had a clear obligation to provide a satisfactory future for the Nauruans, which involved either finding an island for them or receiving them into either Australia, New Zealand or the UK, or all three countries, while of course having great regard to the views of the Nauruans themselves. Australia's position oscillated between group relocation on the one hand and individual immigration and assimilation into a metropolitan society on the other. Perhaps this toing and froing was because of the difficulties of finding a single relocation site. And by 1959, the UN itself was saying that they thought earnest consideration should be given to allowing Nauruans to migrate as individuals or households to one of the partner government's countries or to one of their territories, where the standard of living was comparable to that already enjoyed by the Nauruans. So in 1960, the three partner governments themselves said, we think the only feasible option would be gradual migration or resettlement to our metropolitan territories, predominantly Australia. Now at this time, the population, the indigenous population of Nauru was around 2,500 people. So the idea was that they would gradually migrate individually rather than as a community over a period of at least 30 years. This would ease pressure in Nauru by opening up living space, and it would also provide new opportunities for those who moved. According to Nauruan documents at the time, it was never envisaged that everybody would take up the offer. Many would stay, and Nauru would always remain a spiritual home for those who did resettle. The terms of settlement, and these were agreed by the partner governments, would include citizenship in the new country, equal opportunity and freedom of social contact. Young people would receive education to the fullest extent of their capabilities, as well as a £600 allowance per year for 5 years, after which time they would be assisted to find jobs. Adults who came, who were able to work, and for whom suitable jobs could be found, were to receive their passage, a house, maintenance for 6 weeks, further training or the tools necessary for self-employment, and would be eligible, if they needed it, for social security. But the Nauruans rejected the offer, arguing that the very nature of the scheme would lead to their assimilation into the metropolitan communities where they settled. In Australia, the Age newspaper expressed what was probably a well-meaning, but ultimately paternalistic and disempowering view that, and I quote, "the direct route to complete assimilation would be the best way to handle the problem, because there should be no racial enclaves in Australia and no second-class citizenship for these Pacific people." In December 1960, the Nauruans requested an island of their own in a temperate zone off the Australian coast. Fraser Island was identified as the preferred option. And Australia, while willing to entertain this idea, made very clear up front that sovereignty would not be transferred. When an expert survey concluded that Fraser Island didn't offer sufficiently strong economic prospects to support the population, the Nauruans assumed that this was simply an excuse on the part of the Queensland government to deny their resettlement altogether. And indeed, the archival materials show that the timber industry was keenly opposed to any move. That same year, the Minister for Territories in Australia appointed a Director of Nauruan Resettlement, who was tasked with assiduously combing the South Pacific, looking for spare islands offering a fair prospect. There might still be a person doing that right now for a different outcome. As a result, in 1963, the Australian government offered Curtis Island in Queensland, which is near Gladstone, to the Nauruans. Land on Curtis Island was held privately, but the government planned to acquire it and to grant the Nauruans freehold title over it. Pastoral, agricultural, fishing and commercial activities would be established, and all the costs of resettlement, including housing and infrastructure, would be met by the three partner governments at the estimated cost of £10 million. While Australia once again said sovereignty would not be surrendered, they did say they would grant the Nauruans freedom of movement and the right to manage their own local administration and to make domestic laws or regulations applicable to their own community. This, of course, was subject to their acceptance of the privileges and responsibilities of Australian citizenship. This degree of autonomy might be fairly described as self-government, explained the Director of Nauruan Resettlement to the UN Trusteeship Council. But once again, Nauru rejected the offer, deeming these political arrangements to be unsatisfactory. The Nauruan representatives feared that they would not be able to maintain their distinct identity and that they would be assimilated without trace into the Australian landscape. And this is what they said. "Your terms insisted on us becoming Australians with all that citizenship entails, whereas we wish to remain as a Nauruan people in the fullest sense of the term, even if we were resettled on Curtis Island. To owe allegiance to ourselves does not mean that we are coming to your shores to do you harm, or to become the means whereby harm will be done to you through us. We have tried to assure you of this from the beginning. Your reply has been to the effect that we cannot give such an assurance as future Nauruan leaders and people may not think the same as we do." The Nauruans proposed the creation of a sovereign Nauruan nation governed by Nauruans in their own interest, but related to Australia by a treaty of friendship. External affairs, defence, civil aviation and quarantine would remain in the hands of Australia. This, the Nauruans argued, would safeguard Australia against anything which might endanger its national security. But when Australia refused the offer, Nauru accused the government of not taking its proposal seriously. Australia's offer of resettlement was finally rejected by the Nauruans in July 1964. Nauruan and Australian perspectives on the issue reveal very different views as to why it failed. The Nauruans claimed that resettlement was offered as a quick fix solution that would cost the Australians far less than rehabilitating their land. It was, they said, an attempt to break up their identity and their strong personal and spiritual relationship with the island. And they said it ignored the right of the Nauruan people and international law to permanent sovereignty over their natural wealth and resources. Hamid Robert, the head chief, said that his people were never seeking full sovereign independence over Curtis Island, but that anything which did not preserve and maintain their separate identity would be quite unacceptable. In summarising their rejection of Australia's resettlement offer then, the Nauruans explained the following. We feel that the Australian people have an image of Nauruans which is quite wrong, but which the government has made little effort to correct. Australians seem to have a picture of an absurdly small people who want too much from Australia, who want complete sovereign independence, and who are not as grateful as they should be for what Australia is generously offering them. We feel that most Australians think that the predicament facing the Nauruan people today, which has given rise to their need for resettlement elsewhere, is due to natural overpopulation and the would-be sophistication of the younger Nauruan generation. We feel that government propaganda aimed at shifting the blame to natural causes and evolution is responsible for this unfair emphasis, but have met with very little success. Although such factors may be regarded as contributory, it is wrong to attribute the necessity of resettlement wholly or primarily to them. We submit again that the main need for resettlement arises out of the physical destruction of the island and its attendant problems. 4/5 of our island is phosphate bearing, and therefore in the end, that much will be destroyed. By contrast, the Australian government pinned the failure of the resettlement negotiations precisely on the issue of sovereignty. Seemingly frustrated by what it perceived as their own generous and genuine attempt to meet the wishes of the Nauruan people, Australia told the UN that while they were prepared to give the Nauruans a degree of autonomy in managing their affairs, they could not see their way clear to transferring sovereignty of territory, which was at present part of Australia. Interestingly, this very issue resurfaced in 2003, when Alexander Downer, then Australia's Foreign Minister, was reported as saying that he was considering the resettlement of Nauru's population in Australia and had instructed officials in his department to make plans for it. He was quoted as saying that he was very concerned about Nauru's future prospects because, I quote, it was bankrupt and widely regarded as having no viable future. Australian officials were reported as saying the country was wholly unsustainable, noting that it had only been kept running by $30 million in funding over the previous 2 years to run Australia's offshore processing centres for asylum seekers. The resettlement proposal of 2003 was dismissed by the President of Nauru, who said once again it would undermine Nauru's identity and culture. In contemporary international discussions around the impacts of climate change and natural disasters on, for instance, low-lying Pacific Island countries, planned relocation has been identified as a possible strategy to help. But cultural misunderstandings about the importance of land and identity remain today. The importance of matters like the right to self-determination, self-governance, the preservation of identity and culture, and the right to control resources. Past experiences in the Pacific show the potentially deep, intergenerational psychological consequences of planned relocation, which probably explain why it is considered to be an option of last resort in that region. The absence of bilateral, regional, or international migration frameworks means that it's unclear how many Pacific Islanders might have the opportunity to move voluntarily in anticipation of longer-term changes to their islands. This, in turn, might also affect whether and how any cross-border community relocation would occur. But it seems very unlikely that any country today would provide a dedicated portion of land capable of housing the whole population of a small island state, which is why any future relocations that do occur are far more likely to involve smaller settlements in a variety of areas. In 2009, I asked the President of Kiribati whether he would like to be able to retain some form of self-governance for Kiribati were the whole population ultimately moved elsewhere. And he said, quite frankly, that's an issue that I've never really focused on. I focus on getting our people to survive. But these issues, well, I think at some point in time they will have to be addressed. But if you're scattering your people in different parts of the globe, how do you retain national unity? The matters that concerned Nauru 60 years ago continue to resonate today. Meanwhile, of course, Australia has designated Nauru as a country of resettlement, but for a different purpose, of course. For refugees who sought to reach Australia by boat, but who've been denied the opportunity to settle in Australia. Australia's agreement in turn with Cambodia to resettle any refugees on Nauru who are willing to be transferred there, 4 thus far, reveals Australia's implicit acknowledgement of the many obstacles to successful long-term resettlement on Nauru, not least the fact that Nauru has put a 5-year time limit on their stay. For refugees who have settled on Nauru, and there were 485 as at the end of March this year, they live with a well-founded fear of being assaulted or becoming the victim of a violent crime, including rape. They have highly limited prospects for meaningful employment or social engagement and face a local culture of resentment. Numerous allegations of abuse, including sexual abuse, have been recounted in reports by the Australian Human Rights Commission, the Moss Review, and the Senate Select Committee on the recent allegations relating to conditions and circumstances at the Regional Processing Centre in Nauru, the report that came out yesterday. Last year, over 50 single male refugees who had been resettled in Nauru issued the following statement, and I quote, "We are living in a camp in the jungle. We want to tell you in Australia that we are here like animals. We came to Australia as asylum seekers for safety and for our future. We stayed in Nauru at the Immigration Detention Centre for 11 to 12 months. Now, we are accepted as refugees, and they have given us safety. But what can we do with this if there is no future for us? There is no meaning. We all came with our hopes and our wishes to help our family and ourselves. But now we have no future, no hope. In our country, the Taliban will come onto the bus and they will slash our throat and finish your life. It will take maybe 10 or 15 minutes for us to die. But the English Australian men are killing us by pain, taking our soul and our life slowly. In this case, Australia doesn't need to find an empty island to resettle these people from Nauru. Instead, it has a responsibility to bring them to Australia, to resettle them in the community, and to provide them with durable and meaningful protection in accordance with the obligations that our government has voluntarily assumed under international law."